Morning everyone, welcome to our Hyperdrive webinar. We'll get a chance to talk to you about applying Hyperdrive to boost your culture maturity journey. My name's John Barclay. For those who haven't met me, I know there's a few people on here today who have met me before, so welcome. Hope you get a chance to enjoy today's session and get some insights around some of the work that we've been doing around culture maturity. For those who haven't met me, I started Barclayss just over 2 years ago to help leaders grow and create positive cultures within workplaces and help keep people safe. Today we wanted to take the opportunity just to talk you through not only our Hyperdrive program, but give you some insights to some of the key aspects to creating a much more mature culture around safety as well as performance. So just some things we're going to go through today. We'll do some quick introductions. I've got my colleague with me today, Tony. I'll let him introduce himself and take you through the first part of the webinar. Just some things around the webinar. When you're logged on a webinar, everyone's muted. So if you want to ask a question or if you want to ask us something and interact with us, there's a couple of things you need to think about. One is at the bottom, you'll see a Q&A. That allows you to write your question in text, and we can get to that when we get to the Q&A part at the end. If you want to talk to us and ask us a question and come back and forth with us, then please just use the raise hand function. And Sebastian, who I was just talking to around getting started, will also unmute you and allow you to actually ask us questions, and we can have a bit of a discussion around something you want to talk about. So fairly simple process. This it's scheduled for an hour. We normally find we get into about 45, 50 minutes of content, sometimes a little bit less, but it allows enough time at the end for some Q&A and give us a chance to let you know what we can do for you or continue the conversation after today. So I'm going to hand over to Tony, who's going to introduce himself and then give you the introduction to Hyperdrive. So thank you.
Thanks, John. Morning, everybody. My name's Tony Whitcomb. I'm the Director of Consulting at Barclayss. Prior to this role, I've been sort of in senior operations and health and safety, environmental quality roles for the last 25 years, around multinationals, both in Australia and in Europe, and had some been involved in some fairly significant change programs, I'm sure like many of you. Change programs themselves are difficult things to achieve, and probably, certainly in my experience, are probably more likely to be unsuccessful than successful, even if leaders can get through getting their teams to understand the reasons why the change is needed to be made. The how of the change and the what of the change often are problematic, and organisations struggle. And so to help that process, we've developed what we call our Hyperdrive program to be able to provide organisations with the route through a change process. We're using the theme of space. It's helpful to gives some language and some clarity to the actual journey that we're taking people through. It's a bit of fun. People will recognise some of the terminology and be able to use that through their own change processes. And I think it reflects often some of the difficulties that organisations have. Some relatively famous space leaders once said that safety was the final frontier. Whilst I'm not suggesting that organisational change is a frontier, it can have some of the same challenges that we find are in place when travelling through space. The Hyperdrive program is a 5-stage process, and we see ourselves in this process as organisational explorers. So we help organisations explore their journey through travelling through space through these 5 different steps. The difficulty and some of the challenges with space travel is that often people are a bit unsure about where to go. So organisations know that they've probably got a mission, but they struggle to get through we call it the white space, the difficult areas in the business that they are struggling to understand, or they don't know. They know they've got a problem, but they're not quite sure what the problem is. White space can be quite blinding, or the light is quite blinding, and therefore people are not particularly clear about what it is they need to do. They may understand that there's a need to travel through a journey, but they're not quite sure what to do, or how to get there, or maybe not quite sure where to go. The 5-step process that we've got here provides a structure and a process for organisations to go through. So we can take your space travellers, your leaders, through this 5-stage process, all the way from setup, which is where we get a setup and discovery, where we help you understand where you are, where you need to be, some of the key challenges that you've got to tackle while you're going through your organisational change journey. working out from a navigation point of view, what direction, what journey, where's your journey heading to? How do you work out what that looks like? And then actually taking you through the actual journey of takeoff, transforming what you do, and then importantly at the end, making sure that you can continue that journey by yourself. We're not here, our intention is not to stay with you all the way through your full organisational change journey. We want to make sure that we leave you with a situation where you can continue your flight plan and your journey without necessarily without us necessarily holding your hand all the way through that process. All organisations find themselves already in a particular level of organisational culture. We use 4 different worlds to describe the organisational culture world, reacting all the way through to integral. And in that journey, there are certain things that organisations will experience as they go through that journey. And we're using the symbols again of space to help describe those. So at the sort of reacting level, at the close level, the plane is there as a symbol of organisations that simply just travel around the same orbit, but never actually manage to break through into the next level of organisational culture. Those organisations that manage to journey beyond the world that they're in will embark, when they embark on that journey, they'll experience hazards along the way. The meteors are there to identify the small sorts of hazards or the small types of hazards that they'll experience as they travel through the journey. The black holes, which are the black circles, are reflecting of some of the more bigger issues that they'll experience when they travel through this journey. And we'll get on to some of the details behind these in the coming slides. The satellite identifies the fact that every journey requires some sort of map or some sort of communication process that allows them to transfer through from each world as they go forward. And the rocket indicates the fact that the journey is expected to take you from a reacting culture into an integral culture. But whilst the rocket suggests that it's a straight path, we all know that it isn't quite as straight as that. And the white rings are the indications of white space. And that's the difficult areas that organisations find to transfer through as they go through their cultural maturity journey. As organisational explorers, we can help organisations transfer through those white areas and get to the next level of organisational culture. On any space journey, one of the most difficult areas and one of the most difficult challenges is the takeoff. To break Earth's gravity requires a consistent and large amount of sustained effort to get through break through the gravitational pull of the Earth, to allow the journey to start. In a leadership sense, these are some of the examples of leadership gravities that organisations have to break through in order to take off on their organisational change journey. Some of these may well be very familiar to you, and some of them may not be. We've all probably had the experience of finding difficulties in getting changes started in organisations. People don't recognise or don't believe that there's a need to make a change. They may not be quite sure about what the change is going to give them, and so therefore they're quite fearful. They may not necessarily have enough time or resources to be able to start a change journey, or to keep the change going long enough to be able to get it to its end point. Or equally, they're not quite sure what change journey, what's the change journey all about, and therefore that lack of clarity is enough for them not to be able to start the process going forward. Our Hyperdrive model, particularly at the sort of setup and discovery stages, we can spend our time exploring within your organisation what are the struggles that will stop you from taking off, and how can we work through strategies or activities to be able to reduce or mitigate that impact, so therefore that the takeoff doesn't turn out to be the disaster that it can be if we don't tackle some of the issues that will stop you from breaking through the gravity. The plane circling around the world is indicative of the fact that very often we find ourselves just circling through the same issues and not actually breaking through gravity field. And again, some of the things on the screen are examples of what can tie the plane to the world. We can help you break through that and allow the plane to actually take off rather than just keep circling. Once the journey starts, that's not the end of the challenges. There are still some fairly significant challenges as you travel through your space journey. And one of the more obvious ones and one of the more significant ones are black holes. Black holes have an immense amount of gravitational pull. They suck in everything that's in a close proximity and a far proximity. And they require you to travel at the speed of light to be able to break free from the gravitational pull. Once you get caught in its pull, it's extremely difficult to be able to break yourself away. In a leadership sense, there are many black holes that leaders can find themselves getting pulled into and stopping them from progressing on their change journey after they've taken off. And there are some examples on the screen. And we've probably all had this experience during our own change journeys, where some of these things have actually caused us not to be able to make the change in the way that we wanted to make the change. The issues that we get when leaders are focusing purely on trying to find people to blame for every situation that occurs and when it occurs. Some of the issues that we have when leaders are wholly focused on using numbers as a way of demonstrating good performance and drive the business through the management of numbers, forgetting that behind every number there is often a person who's more important than the number. And equally, the tremendous amount of effort and concentrated focus that's put on protecting individual departments and making sure the departments look good and making sure the departments are protective of the information that they've got, which would be much better, much more valuable to the organisation if they shared it rather than acting in a silo type approach. There are all many examples of black holes that take an inordinate amount of effort and pull lots and lots of resources into them right throughout the organisation and prevent you from making your progress on your journey. Again, in the setup and discovery phase, we can explore some of the details within your organisation that might give you early indications of where your black holes are and give you some strategies on how to avoid them or to detect them very much earlier than you would otherwise do, and hopefully avoid the suck of large amounts of resource that detract away from your change journey. The integral world that you saw on the earlier slides is based on the integral model. This is a fairly well-known model, first developed by Wilbur quite some years ago. It was a way of describing situations, events and occurrences in a holistic sense that could happen or could originate from any part within your organisation. It's a 2x2 matrix, so it's split up into 4 sections and split up into sort of horizontal and vertical processes. The vertical processes, the left-hand side and right-hand side, are basically focused on the way that we think about things. So on the left-hand side, that's about the things that we cannot see, but we know that are there. So it talks about things like values and priorities, and it's focusing on leadership and on the cultural aspects of organisations, value and purpose. The right-hand side is focusing on things that we can see and therefore we can observe, things like behaviours and actions and outcomes, structures and processes that organisations have. The top and the bottom is split and talk about how we think about people. So we either think about people as individuals, which is the top part of the model, or we think about people as in groups or teams, which is the bottom part of the model, in a collective sense. So it's a very, very good and very useful way of working out how we can describe the origin of things. And we use the integral model as part of the definition for our integral world. And we can use the model to help define the individual cultural maturity levels and work out what particular elements of the 4 quadrants are relevant for each of the quadrants within the cultural maturity model. And John will talk a little bit about the 4 levels of cultural maturity when he gets into his presentation. So far, we've been talking predominantly about what we do in the sort of setup and discovery phase of our Hyperdrive model. And they're the challenging and very important parts of the process. But clearly, once we've got through that activity, we then need to think about how we navigate the change. How do we actually get from the takeoff phase into working out where we want to go and what we want to do? This is often the most important part of the process. It's recognizing that the journey itself is more important than necessarily the destination. Without understanding how the journey operates, the destination is much more difficult to arrive at. So we have a process which takes a small number of leaders within your organization through an exploratory process. We're going through a process of discovery here. We take the details that we've identified in the setup and discovery phase and work out how we're going to integrate those into a program which we then can use in your organization. This is very much about taking and testing out some things and making sure that what we think or what we believe is actually correct and can practically be turned into something which is useful for you and your organization. We test out things, we're looking to prototype or pilot things with a small group of leaders, and it's an iterative process. Its early focus is on what we call our GPS program. The way of thinking about the GPS program is it's the map or chart that you need to generate in your space to understand what's there. Without a map or a chart, floating around in space is very easy to quickly get lost. And you end up spending a lot of energy and effort and attention on trying to reconfigure your journey, trying to re-engineer where you're intending to go, without any real understanding about where it is you're trying to get to. So the GPS part of the process is defining the map. What does your space area look like? Once we've defined the map, the next stage of the process then is to go through working out what's the flight plan. The flight plan effectively is your journey. It's your route map through your world, through your space world, to get you from where you are to where you want to go. And trying to minimize the number of times that you have to recorrect or change your direction to get you back on track. It's trying to avoid cul-de-sacs and trying to avoid lost avenues where you can spend a lot of time without making any progress. And so the flight plan gives you the route through your area of change to get you from where your takeoff starts to where you want to get to. The iterative cycles allow us to hone that and get that flight plan more detailed and better and improve the quality before we then go through the launch process, which is what we call our transformation or transform stage. You'll notice on the flight plan overheads that there are weeks indicated. This is it's an indicative week process. The actual number of weeks will be very much determined by the size of your area, the amount of space that we've got to go through, the number of iterative cycles that we need to get through to get to a point where we're comfortable and confident that the flight plan has got the right level of detail. Some organisations it will be shorter, some organisations it might be a little bit longer. But it's very much a process that will be tailored to your organisation rather than just following a model which is the same for every organisation. And equally, it's using people within your organisation to test out some of the things that we believe are required and necessary to allow you to work through your change process. All good journeys start with a spaceship. You can't imagine Star Wars without the Millennium Falcon or Star Trek without the USS Enterprise. The spaceship's a really important part of the journey. And our journey is no different. We don't have a physical spaceship like you had in Star Wars or Star Trek. We have a virtual spaceship, which is based on our 5 C's coaching model. But like the physical spaceships, it has some of the same properties that you would expect to find in a spaceship. So it's robust. It's able to stand the test of the journey with all of the issues the journey will entail in terms of the troubles and the difficulties that are involved in travelling through space. It's got agility, so it's able to change and move when it needs to, when it's buffeted by the winds of change or the issues the hazards and issues that you find when you're travelling in an area which is partly unknown and partly not. It's got a good communication process. It's important to maintain good communication with the command centre, with mission control, and so our 5 C's process has equally good communication channels to be able to do that. And importantly, the engine is strong enough to be able to get through the issues of gravity when we go through a takeoff process. So we use the analogy of the spaceship, particularly in relation to our 5 C's process, to ensure that the change process and the way that the change process occurs can occur in a robust and positive environment. So once we've been through the first 3 phases and we get into the last 2 phases, this is the transformation and transfer process. As with all journeys into space, part of the early stage is about the pre-flight activities and making sure that the early part of the journey is set up. So we go through some pre-flight activities around ensuring your organisation understands what the journey is. So there's some work in terms of communicating that activity around the organisation, particularly now that we're going to get all leaders involved in that process rather than the small group of leaders that we had in place when we were going through the navigation phase. We ensure that the content that we defined and developed through that flight plan activity is deployed around the organisation. So leaders have a view about some of the materials and some of the activity that they're going to get involved with. And we confirm how long is the journey going to take? What's the schedule we need to work our way through to get all of the leaders in the organisation, all of the space travellers through the journey process. Then we get into the 5 C's, as you see on the screen there. The first C, the context, is a deep immersement in a workshop-style environment where we give your leaders the core skills and the core concepts that they're going to need to be able to work their way through the journey, the change journey, particularly when we get to the destination, to be able to build on that journey so that the journey can continue when we, as explorers, begin to withdraw ourselves from the process. So that's a deep immersement, and we put in the right amount of time to be able to make sure that your leaders, your space travellers, have got enough competency to be able to start that journey. The next stage is go through comfort and confidence. Is about giving, on a one-to-one process, more coaching from our space explorers to ensure that we grow the level of capability and confidence with each individual leader. There's a process to ensure that they understand and get comfortable with what they're doing, and then they can then build their confidence to be able to take those skills and those competencies that they've learned and take them into your organisation and begin the process of transformation from within your organisation. As we get through that process, we then get into the final stages, which is the competency and consistency. And we begin to transfer from the transform stage into the transfer stage, particularly the back end. We're getting consistency, where we're there as explorers to ensure that your leaders are doing and completing the process in a consistent manner. And we can then gradually make our way away from your journey and allow your journey to continue, but without necessarily that high level of guidance that we've been providing in the early stages. It's a fairly detailed and a fairly comprehensive process, but like all good processes, it needs some good, strong foundations to be able to make it work. And so John's going to go through some of the details now in terms of what the foundation and principles that we've employed as part of the development of our Hyperdrive program. John?
Thanks, Tony. Well, thanks, Tony, for that. It was good just to get a high-level overview of what it takes to navigate your way through culture change. And I think the main things to think about there is really being able to set up and discover exactly what is happening in the business, what's exactly happening in teams, while also understanding where it is you want to go and what it's going to take to get there, and what are some of the things happening in the business that are pitfalls or black holes. And when we think about having to take that journey, you really want a robust process to do that. And the 5 C's, for those who have been working with me before, you know that 5 C's process is about establishing the right skill sets up front, sitting down with people one-on-one. So when we talk about that individual, so that integral model where it's one-on-one, is a chance to really look at the individual side of where they're comfortable and confident to move forward. When you get to the collective group, then it's the collective competence and consistency. And that's what the 3 in a row is all about, where there's actually built-in internal coaching and supporting for each other. So when we walk out and when we leave and leave you to your journey, you have those internal capabilities to continue that coaching through that 3 in a row process. And the reason why the coaching is so important is because people still fall into the black holes. They're drawn into them. So the things we spoke about around blame and judgment and silos and focusing in on the numbers or the rules, that's the opportunity for the coaching to actually draw them, your light speed, to draw them away from the black hole. So there's lots of different principles that sit in here, and I just wanted to start with 2 foundational principles. One is the behavioural science behind it all, because culture is all a group of beliefs and behaviours or the way we do things around here. So it's very behavioural orientated, but we know there's a lot of internal attributes when it comes to what drives behaviour and what motivates it. So I just want to start with the overall way of thinking about this, and this is how leaders need to actually actively look at the way they engage with their people and try and create some level of reliability of behaviour within their teams. And this is where it starts to cover both the internal and the external part of the integral model. So the first one starts with getting to know your people so you know their experiences and you get an understanding of their beliefs. If you don't understand individuals' belief systems, what's important to them, what drives them, then your ability to really influence their decision-making process becomes very, very difficult. So the first thing leaders need to understand is I need to get to know my people well enough to understand exactly what their belief systems are. And the second part to that is really knowing what knowledge is required for them to be consistent in the way they do their work. So what knowledge do they have? What knowledge do they need? And make sure we've got a really clear plan to fill those knowledge gaps. So when we work with leaders in that coaching piece and that skills piece, it's given them the comfort and the confidence and the competency to really work in with their team to understand beliefs, knowledge, and know exactly how to move forward with that. Then we get into what we call the during stage of behaviour, where behaviour is actually quite active. And there's two things going on there. There's one where we're setting expectations around the work and how we want the work done. And then the second part is how they actually do the work or the behaviour itself. Now that's quite dynamic, and I'll talk a bit more about some considerations in the next slide around how that can be very difficult to manage, and there's some things you need to think about. But all that before stage is what leaders are doing all the time. It's all about creating that shared sense of beliefs and that shared sense of knowledge and understanding. So you've got a very strong cultural foundation and a systems foundation and an internal belief system that on their own can create those more effective behaviours. That's not where it stops. Behaviour is happening all the time. Leaders need to be thinking about how do I reinforce everything that's going on, and how do I create a momentum in that behaviour where people start to recognise the importance or even potentially changing some of those limiting beliefs. So the first one is every time there's a behaviour, there's a result. So people feel things about what they're doing. They feel, scared, they feel stressed, they feel anxiety, or they feel happy, they feel pride, they feel a sense of accomplishment, or sometimes they feel that was easy, they feel that was comfortable, they feel that was safe, right? So in that result stage, our job as a leader is understand how people are feeling about the work. How are they actually negotiating their way through that work? What are some of those things that's happening that's reinforcing either limiting beliefs or starting to move us forward to some new, more helpful beliefs? The second part of after is around how we give feedback. So feedback's about specific information to people so they understand the context of what they're doing in the way we want it done, either culturally or effectiveness, efficiency, safety, quality, whatever it is that we're trying to maintain in that environment, is how are we giving feedback in a very specific way that allows them to grow their knowledge, right, around what's happening and what's important. That's on an individual basis. The last sort of stage of that is more of the collective, the group. So how do we discuss this as a team and as a group so we all understand how we improve? So those after parts, understanding the results people are getting, understanding the individual feedback that's needed, and reviewing things as a team is all about growing it and enhancing trust. Because ultimately, to get to an integral culture, you need a lot of trust and very low fear. So if you've got this reliability model occurring within your leaders, then what ends up happening is transparency opens up. We start to understand beliefs in a greater detail. We start to understand decisions in a much greater detail, and people trust the expectations and the feedback they're getting to continually grow that behaviour. So the behavioural reliability model sets up the foundation for all those 5 C's. When we look at the behavioural science model, which comes off a pretty typical ABC analysis that was done back in the 50s and 60s, is trying to tease it out in a little bit more detail, because the problem with a too simplistic approach is we can misunderstand exactly how to use those levers. So when we think about those experiences and knowledge, it's all about those pre-triggers, something before that's happening before behaviour happens, right? And those are systems, cultural, they're all the predefined expectations and standards we set in the business. So that's understanding what's important to us. So we talked about them as values, we talked about them as principles, we talk about them as general overarching expectations or cultural expectations within the business. So that's all the pre-trigger stuff. That's how we set the foundation for what's important around here. And that's all dealing with those beliefs and knowledge. Right in the moment where decisions are made, they're heavily impacted by the situation and the environment that's happening for people. So the pressure that's on me now, we're falling behind. Maybe the weather's coming in. Maybe another team member's come in to do some work next to us. So these are very situational, immediate things that happen that impact people's decisions making. And these moments are the ones that can override people's beliefs and knowledge in making the right decision, which was set in the pre-trigger right at the moment, because there's something else going on that's driving a different emotion and driving a different process within a person to go forward. Now, if we haven't established really clear cultural factors on how to handle those situations, we get behaviour in that observable behaviour action part. That's where things, you say, why'd you do that for? That's a dumb thing to do. It's generally because something's happened in that immediate situational environment that's made someone sort of forget the whole complexity of what they're about to do and really make a too simplistic a decision, which ends up creating an error. After the behaviour, we're talking about two things, which is consequences. And natural consequences are those things that happen every single time people perform work. Every time we do anything, there's natural consequences occurring. And they're generally emotional. They're feelings. And we talked about them in regards to levels of stress or anxiety or even happiness or pride, whatever those natural consequences occurring. And that's how people sort of reinforce their beliefs around the way we do things. Now, the second part of that is leaders need to understand what they are. So when they're giving their external consequence part, the feedback, they know how to navigate those. They know how to work through that to keep building smarter choices for people and building trust that we're not doing this in a judgmental way. We're not doing this in a way to blame people. We're actually trying to learn, and we're curious, and we're trying to find out exactly what's happening so we can help people navigate the complexity of doing our work and doing our work safely. That leads us to all those different behaviours that are going on in the workplace. And we can talk about that maturity state, as Tony was alluding to, around either reacting, conforming, achieving, or integral, right? Integral. Now, reacting culture is really when we're firefighting. Like, the culture is, don't worry about it. Well, we'll worry about it if something bad happens. If not, just get on with it. There's generally an absence of feedback. There's generally an absence of setting clear expectations. We're generally letting people go off. We think they're really, they're capable of making good decisions, and they probably are, but we're not setting up the foundation, and we're only reacting and putting things in place when things go wrong. Versus a conforming culture or a compliance culture where it's really rules driven. We think we can drive the behaviour purely through the rules. Right? Now, rules are important because they give us the standard, they give us an outline of what we're expecting of people. But when we just focus in on the rules, we're not dealing with beliefs, and we're not always dealing with the right level of knowledge. And therefore, then we're setting expectations that create a bit of fear. And therefore, what normally happens with leadership behaviour after that is we generally give our feedback in a way that's generally on the blame side or the discipline side only, and we're not actually engaging the whole complexity of the emotion that comes with that. And what happens in both of those cultures is generally a fair bit of fear, right? And that's what that does, is hold us back. That holds us back from really understanding what's possible, what's really needed here. While nothing bad's happening, we think it's all okay, and then we get caught out when a whole bunch of things happen in a row and wonder what's happened. Versus the last two stages, which are about achieving cultures or integral cultures, integral cultures. That's really when it's all about performance. It's very proactive. It's really focusing on what we need to do to improve. It's highly curious. And the only real separation between those two is achieving cultures still a little bit in the silo mentality, where I'm just really worried about my team or my department's performance. And as long as we're performing, then we're in a good place. Now, that can seem really important because that's the first stage of getting to the integral culture part. But the integral culture really means I'm now really focused on how we're impacting everyone around us. So we can be really performing on our own, but if logistics aren't performing, then they're holding us back, right? They're holding us back from being as successful as an organisation as we can be. If the recruitment of talent is a problem, then all of a sudden, again, we're being held back. While we're really on the focus of being proactive and performance orientated, we're missing those really critical opportunities to be hole in our performance around the organisation because we're only worried about our own area. So while achieving cultures are a huge step forward, it's the first step to come into the integral stage. So that's the bit that drives the foundation around the 5 C's and drives the whole process around how leaders create the change in culture. And it really comes from the behavioural process of creating higher trust, influencing beliefs, understanding knowledge and setting clear expectations and giving feedback, right? When it comes to safety, there's a very specific foundation we want to talk about when it comes to how we actually talk about safety, because culture comes from the way we talk about things and the way people listen and perceive things based on how we use our language in our business. And the CARE model, or the definition of safety, is exactly what starts to change the way we talk about safety within our business, because there's some real dilemmas when we get that language wrong. So I want to start with this. When I started to talk to people like 20 odd years ago around what safety was or what safe work meant to people, I got some really different answers to that, but the majority of them were outcome-based. So what I mean by that is when I ask people what does safety mean or what does safe work mean, well, it means people don't get hurt. Right? It's absence of harm, zero harm, injury-free, incident-free, people going home safely or going home the same way they came to work. They're all really good internal values. Like, we don't want to hurt people. So they're values driven, but it's not what safety is. It's actually not an actionable thing that you want people to have. Yeah, you want people to believe zero harm is possible and you want people to believe we shouldn't hurt people, but that's not what safety is. And there's a real dilemma when we embed that language in our business, because what happens when people start to connect absence of harm to safety is every time they do work without getting hurt, that's the right thing to do. That's literally the way the brain programs that information, because here's the work I'm doing, I didn't get hurt, so that's the right way to do it, because the measure of success is zero harm or incident-free or injury-free. How many times do we go home every day the same way we came to work? Lots, but does it mean we've been safe? No, that's the bit we need to start to unpeel. So let me talk through a couple of examples here, the difference between outcome focus and action focus. So this is a bit of a story around a couple of kids in a park. They're climbing up on a tree. Their parents are talking away. Just when the parents turn around, they notice the kids have got pretty high up in the tree. The first parent yells out, "Johnny, don't fall." The second parent yells out, "Julia, hold on." Right at that moment, Johnny falls, right? And when we think about unpacking that, when the kids are playing or working, when they're doing their job or doing their activity, they're in what's called fast brain mode. So they're literally doing things really without thinking. The brain's processing things on a natural instinct level. Now, when we say to someone, don't do that or don't or avoid that, there's no real clarity for that fast brain to stick to. So what happens is it gets distracted, it processes a whole heap of different information and it can lose its concentration or it can lose its attention to what's most important in that moment. So what happened to Johnny was got distracted in that processing bit, in that split second, in that millionth of a second, lost his grip and fell. Where Julia, even in fast brain mode, busy doing the job, busy doing her fun activity, was given a very clear instruction. The brain didn't have to process anything except hold on and then find out what to do next. Another example of this that I like to use as well is a bit of a sporting analogy. I like my sport. And when you think about a batter going out to bat, and as they're facing up to the bowler and the bowler's running in, and the batter's got, the torque going on and saying to themselves, don't get out, don't get out, don't get out, don't get out. And as the ball's bowled, plays and misses and gets out. Now, the next batter that comes in, facing the bowler's running in, this batter's saying to themselves, watch the ball, watch the ball, watch the ball. And as the ball's bowled, the focus that comes in on that, and everything else goes away, but the focusing on that allows them to concentrate on the ball and play the ball and continue playing. Another example of this, the personal experience I had of this was with my son. And you think about our role as a coach to coordinate people's thinking patterns and what they're doing to make their decisions. My son plays soccer, if you're not from Australia and you're more from Europe, football. He's been playing it his whole life and he's actually pretty good. He loves taking free kicks at training. He puts them in the top corner very frequently, at least 8 to 9 times out of 10. Top corner every single time. So naturally what happens during a game, when we're actually in the action, he's given the role to take the free kicks. Now in that moment when there's other things going on, so that situational environment, there's a bit more pressure on now, there's noises, there's other things going on, there's generally a wall in front of you bouncing around. His mindset changes to, you know, kicking it straight to the goalie. And when you talk to him about that and what his mindset is actually don't miss. Because in that situation, everything's changing for him. He's saying don't miss. So I said to him, what are you saying at training? Because at training, you're putting it in the top net. You've still got a wall in front of you. You've still got your players around you, but you're scoring them 9 times out of 10. He said, I'm just saying put it in the top corner. So it's another example where you've got to unpack not just the behaviour you see, but you've got to unpack what's happening for them and what's thinking for them. Now, when we think about that, when it comes to how we think and the process at a real simplistic level, is when we're doing our work, we're doing it at a subconscious level, an unconscious level, and we're doing that in the fast brain mode. And depending on how we're focusing in on things, we either stay in fast brain mode and miss opportunities for adjusting to change or adjusting to circumstance, or we're able to slow that brain down and really become methodical and really start to think through what we need to do. So in Corey's case, when he's playing soccer and taking a free kick, it's slowing his brain down and focusing in on the top corner and all the mechanics that come with that behaviourally allow him to execute what it is that he wants to do. When you think about the batter facing a bowler, it's about slowing everything down so I can focus in on what's most important right now. Get out of that fast brain mode in the moment so I can actually concentrate on what's most important. And when it comes to the kids playing around in their tree, it's recognising as a leader, if I'm giving someone an instruction in the moment, I need to understand it needs to be instructionally orientated, not outcome orientated. Every single one of the ones where we were getting a poorer outcome was outcome focused, something to avoid. Don't fall, don't get out, don't miss. And if we think about the way we talk about safety as zero harm, injury-free, incident-free, the message we're hearing is don't get hurt. Right? And that's what ends up happening is we actually associate it the wrong way and we don't engage our slow brain effectively enough to really get behavioural reliability. So what is safety? Well, we talk about safety as controlling and reducing exposure. So that's the action I take. Every time I go and do a job, I need to focus in on what my hazards are, basically the things that can cause me harm. Then I need to think about how do I interact with them, so my behaviour, so then it impacts my level of exposure. And depending on what I've identified as the hazard and what I've identified as the way to interact with them, I've either controlled my exposure or I've at least reduced it significantly. Now, if I don't focus in on that properly and I don't identify the hazard correctly and I don't interact with it the most effective way, I could actually be increasing my exposure or leaving my exposure uncontrolled. So when we think about how we do that, there's 2 things we think about when it comes to hazards. Do we leave it uncontrolled or do we control it? So do we put no hard controls in place? So those who are familiar with the hierarchy of controls, we're talking about just relying on things like PPE and admin, or do we put hard controls in place such as engineering and above? All right? And most of the time we fall into the engineering space, maybe a little bit of the isolation or even substitution space. But when it comes to the behaviour, it's really working through 2 things. The at-risk behaviour, what someone does that increases their likelihood of harm, or a safe behaviour which reduces their likelihood of harm. So this isn't about right or wrong, safe or unsafe. This is really looking at, if I'm doing that, is my exposure going up or is my exposure going down? And sometimes we have to do work in a way that actually allows the exposure to go up. And those are the opportunities we have to try and work out what do we need to do about that. So what that gives us is what we call the exposure quadrant. And this is where we can actually look at assessing safe work by how we've actually controlled our exposure. So not by the absence of harm. So we can go 6 months without harm and still be working in what we would call an uncontrolled exposure state, where we've got an uncontrolled hazard and at-risk behaviour occurring. All right? And that's the part we need to come to the realisation. Safe work is about working in the green, where we've controlled our hazards and we've got safe behaviour happening. Now, I'm a realist and a practical. I've been out in the field a lot with people, and I know we can't stay in that green zone forever. There are times when we have to only use admin controls, which means we're up in the top section of that quadrant from the minute we start. Right? So the minute we're only relying on PPE or admin controls and not doing anything physically with the hazard, we're automatically on the top section of that quadrant, which means we're relying heavily on the behaviour. So it's really important for leaders to be able to understand people, help people understand the value of that behaviour and the beliefs behind that behaviour, so it's more consistent, to try and avoid slipping over to the red state, which is uncontrolled. But the minute we're able to find those harder controls means at least we're starting on the bottom section of that quadrant. And that's a leader's role, right? A leader's role is to help people understand what type of controls we have available to us so we can stay on the bottom section of that quadrant. Because people are fallible, they do make mistakes. And if we're actually controlling the hazard physically and starting in the green zone, at least if they forget something as a part of that, where they're standing or where they're positioned or a part of the process to do the job, they're only at least moving over to, at least there's still a reduced level of exposure. It's not controlled, but it's reduced, it's not uncontrolled. Now, the reason why this is really important for us to really learn and apply is years ago, a mentor of mine said to me, the absence of injury does not mean the presence of safety. Now, as a early safety professional, that really confused me because it's like, well, if we're not getting injuries, something must be working. But again, we can be working in that red zone with uncontrolled exposure for long periods of time without harm. It doesn't mean we're safe. So safety is about controlling our exposure, which is the green zone. All right, so that's the important part. And it's a foundational concept to changing maturity of your culture. Getting to know leaders to understand behaviour and know how to influence that in a positive, effective way through trust, but also re-establishing exactly how we frame safety up with our teams and within our business. So those are all the foundations we wanted to cover today. There's probably a couple of other versions of the Hyperdrive webinar we're going to run later, which will introduce some other concepts around how to create that level of maturity. But now I just want to pass over to everyone. There's a Q&A function. So if you want to type a question to us, please feel free to put it in the Q&A function and Sebastian will let us know what that question is, or you can raise your hand and Sebastian will unmute you and we can actually have a chat about the question you've got. So how did we go, Sebastian? Have we got any questions?
No, at the moment there are no questions.
No questions. Nice quiet group. All right. Give you a few moments. Have a think about questions to ask Tony around, the structure of the Hyperdrive program, and some of the, the focus on changing the language to a bit of a space theme around white space, around black holes. If you've got any questions around that, feel free to direct them towards Tony. If there's anything I covered in that behavioural science piece or even that last bit, which can be a little bit challenging for people because I know everyone uses specific language around safety and we need to be mindful of that. I'm happy to have a conversation around the benefits and challenges of language. All right, feel free to keep posing the questions, but now just for me, I just want to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for coming. It's really good to see a couple of returning people who've been to some of our other webinars. It's also really good to see some people I've worked with as a part of our coaching and development within your teams already. So it's good to see you coming on and seeing some of the new things we're trying to do or how we're restructuring some of the things we've been doing. A part of the closeout of the webinar, Sebastian will put a poll up for your feedbacks, just a couple of quick questions, really to really start to give us some feedback. I mean, we're trying really hard to put more of this content out live, so getting feedback from you is really vital to know what's working and what we can be doing differently. We're going to have an email go out. Now, the email will go out to everyone with a couple of main things to it. One is it'll have a link to our LinkedIn group where we continue the conversation. We start to share a bit more of the content that we've just touched on today. I mean, Tony's just really given you a very surface level overview of what Hyperdrive's about. And I've really only just touched the surface on behavioural science and care. So we'll continue the conversation in that LinkedIn group. So if you're really keen to get a bit more information, feel free to step in there. It'll also have in that email a link to YouTube to watch the recording again. So if you if I went a bit quick, I know I can go get my energy up and talk a bit fast.
John, yep. Sorry, we have one question actually from Wade in our chat function. If I can just read it to you. It is a really good point to shift from safety being the absence of injury to present presence of positive risk controls in place. How can you create a compelling case or leverage an event for change?
All right. Thanks, Wade. I love your questions, mate. I really do. I love working with you and getting your questions. To me, I think there's a couple of bits in there that you're asking for. One is a compelling case to change within the business around how they talk about safety and some of the inherent language that's been embedded over the last couple of decades. The experience I've had is it's really been able to get the senior leadership together and unpack the complexity of language and get them to realise some of the hindering factors that come from the current language we're using, but also identify some of the helpful factors that are in the language. I mean, it's not all bad. There's language that goes on in businesses that are actually doing a lot of good, but it's about understanding where that language is coming. So for me, I don't want leaders to shy away from zero harm or incident free. I just want them to understand what that means. That's a value. It's a value for people. It's not what safety is and it's not what we do. So you've got to unpack that belief system around what they're talking about and really place it in the right place. The second part now is probably more towards the execution of work. And you've got to start to unpack the uncomfortability of going away from probably traditional safety risk matrices and actually get them to understand the opportunity that comes with just knowing where the work is being placed and the effectiveness it gives people to know, where am I doing my work? Am I doing it in a controlled state, a reduced state, or an uncontrolled state, to really allow them to consciously choose where they're going to work and know exactly what becomes critical when you're working in that space. So if we're choosing to work in the yellow zone, that's okay. We know that's the case, but we need to make sure they understand the criticality of the 2 or 3 behaviours that actually keep that level of reduction in place. Tony, did you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I think Wade and I have worked together, so Wade knows a little bit about the way that I think. I think part of this is dependent very much on where the organisation is from a cultural maturity point of view. If the organisation has already embarked on change programs and they're not working because there are still some significant events occurring, one of the factors, therefore, or one of the sort of driving factors is the fact that the change programs themselves that they're embarking on are not working. And that in itself can be enough to get people to move from just continuing to do the same things that they've always done to try and do something different. And I think the second option or the second alternative here is it's a little bit of trying to adopt some of the safety to thinking. And there's a difference between work imagined and work done. Organisations get stuck in the situation where they believe the work is being done safely simply because they've got the details written down in a procedure, a JHA, a document, and then they falsely believe that that's the way that the work is actually being done in the field. Getting out into the field and seeing how work is actually done and working out how much difference there is between what the documentation or the belief that the organisation has of how things are done and actually what the operators are doing themselves to actually get the tasks done. Once they get an understanding of that gap, and that gap can be quite large, that in itself can provide some of the driver for change and move them into this exposure model that we certainly very firmly believe is the way forward in changing people's view about how safety works.
Cool. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Wade. Great question as always. Any other questions coming through?
No, so far we have everything. I'm just reading what Wade just replied. Just one moment.
I was on a webinar from Oxford University last night, Associate Leaders as Coaches. Internal company continued learning program, and this delivered more value and takeaways. Yeah, look, thanks, Wade. I mean, it's really important for us to really help organisations understand the leader's role is to coach, and we need to establish them as coaches. So that's, as Tony said, we class ourselves as organisational explorers, and our job is to help leaders go from just travelling through the process to actually become explorers as well and explore what's possible and really look at going forward. So thank you. I'm glad it reinforced some of the stuff you've been going through as well. So look, just as a final thank you, if there is further questions from today, if you want to have a chat to me, feel free to drop me an email, feel free to drop me a call. My advice is probably just get active in the LinkedIn group, because that's where we can actually start addressing things and everyone can see the responses and everyone can see the sharing of learning. It is a private group, so it's not like anyone can see what's going on in there. So it is a chance for us to communicate as a collective community. So that's all we've got for you. Thank you very much again for your time. Sorry for a bit of the the upfront bumpiness to get going. That's us getting used to some technology. So appreciate your patience and your time. Hope you got something out of today. I look forward to talking to you all sometime very soon. So thank you again, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.